You heard about this. It was called the Fire Festival, and it was supposed to have taken place about 2 years ago in the Caribbean, and it was intended to be a music festival. It was planned by a couple of guys. One of them was like a music promoter and kind of a musician, and the other was more of a businessman. And they came together, and they had this, what they thought was a brilliant idea to have something like a Woodstock party, but instead of being in a farm in upstate New York, they wanted to have it in the Bahamas. And so they set about planning this event. They started off using social media. They paid a lot of money to some fairly influential social media people who had a lot of followers on Instagram and that. And these people put pictures of themselves in the Bahamas just living the good life. And those pictures went viral. And pretty soon everyone was talking about this fire festival. And people were paying $5,000, $10,000, $15,000 for the opportunity to travel to the Bahamas for 10 days and to party. And there was supposed to be music. There were supposed to be these well-known bands and musicians coming in, and music and dancing and singing, drinking, food, and partying nonstop. As the planning and as the weeks and months leading up to this event, as those kind of went by, it became more and more obvious that there were some real problems. For starters, the people who were putting on this event had no experience in putting on an event like this. And so, for example, they promised that if you paid $15,000, you can stay in a luxury villa right on the beach. Or if you wanted, you could stay on one of the yachts that would be docked not too far off the beach. And you could party with the celebrities there. Only problem was, there were no villas on the beach, and so they had to resort to Plan B, which was to take these shelters, these tents that had been used for Hurricane Matthew, and they set them up on the beach, and they called those luxury villas. And then the caterer decided that there's no way they could pull off what they were being asked to do, and so a few weeks before the caterer was fired or quit, depending on who you talk to, and so the planners had to go to Plan B, which was to get a local restaurant to provide the food, and they ended up only being able to provide like cheese sandwiches for everybody. The day of the festival comes, and here's the thing, I should add this too, here's the thing, all along the way, you had people telling the organizers, hey, this ain't going to work. You need to cancel this festival because we can't take in hundreds and hundreds or even thousands of people and find a place for them to stay and food to eat. You need to cancel it. But the organizer said, no way. There's no way. Think positively, he kept saying. Think about solutions, not about problems. And he couldn't be bothered to hear the mounting concern. So the day of the festival rolls around. The night before was this massive storm. So all these little tents are just nearly in shambles. There's sand everywhere. It's miserable. And hundreds of people start coming to this island, expecting to party, to wine, women, and song, and everything else. And the minute they start landing on this island, it becomes clear that this is going to be a major disaster. And it was. I won't go into all the details of how it all unraveled, but it was played out on social media. It became famous enough that actually there's 2 documentaries that you can watch out there now that tell the whole story. And to just give you a sense of how badly it went, the organizer, at least the business side of things, is doing 6 years in federal prison for his role in all of this. It was that bad. Now, I tell you that story because I thought about that while I was looking at the story of King Belshazzar, a guy who plans this massive party. He's going to party like never before. There's going to be wine, women, and song for Belshazzar. And even though there were real concerns, and I'll get to those in a moment, Belshazzar would hear none of it. Because Belshazzar, like the organizers of this festival, they had in their minds this picture, this ideal picture of what glitz and glamour would look like, and they became so focused on this image of partying and happiness and what this fancy life would be like, even if just for a few days, that they would hear no objections and no concerns about it. They got so entrapped by this picture. that they would listen to nothing else. And then I got to thinking, isn't that the way that sin works for all of us? I mean, it's easy to point the finger at a guy who organizes a party in the Bahamas. It's easy to look at a guy like Belshazzar and see the problems. But isn't this the way that sin works all the time? You know, we get so caught up in the image of something that we desire, something that is wrong, something that's destructive, but we want to hear none of it. We just get so captured by our desires, and we fail to see how destructive sin can really be. And that's what Daniel 5 really is all about. Daniel 5 tells the story of what happens when, well, first of all, what happens when we want to party? What is that party all about? And then what happens when God breaks into that party? And that's what I want to look at this morning as we look at this story. I want to show us two things. I want to show us what happens when the presence of God breaks into the party, crashes the party, if you like, and what happens when the finger of God writes on the wall. What happens when the presence of God crashes the party, and what happens when the finger of God writes on the wall? Now we're told right there in verse 1 that Belshazzar is throwing a party. Belshazzar was probably like the great-great-great-great-grandson of King Nebuchadnezzar. If you can follow it back historically, we've been looking at it all the time. We've been looking in the book of Daniel. We've been following the story of King Nebuchadnezzar, who was the king of Babylon. He dies, and then there's a long line of succession. In fact, there's about 60 years in between the end of Nebuchadnezzar's life and Belshazzar. That gives you a sense. This is a long period of time. This is, we might miss that just reading through the Bible, but there's a long period of time. And now Belshazzar steps into power, and he throws this party. Now, we might look at that and say, well, what's so wrong about throwing a party? I mean, that's something that kings do. But there's more to the story. Historians have actually traced this out, and they can pinpoint the date that this actually happened. It was October 11 of, I think it was 536 BC, and they do that looking at historical records and what else was going on in the world. And here's what else was going on in the world. You had the Babylonian Empire, and it had been around for a very long time, but over time it had gotten weaker. And in the meantime, you have another empire, the Persian Empire. And the Persian Empire is getting stronger and stronger. And by the time October 11th of 536 BC rolls around, the Persian Empire has actually surrounded the Babylonian capital. And they're pounding down the walls. And they're threatening this Babylonian Empire. And every Babylonian is thinking to themselves, what's going to happen? They're tense, they're anxious, they're afraid because they see, if you'll excuse the terrible pun, the handwriting on the wall before there was handwriting on the wall. They see that danger is imminent, and the Persian army is going to come in and destroy the Babylonians, and what's going to happen to them? And King Belshazzar says, I don't care. No one can touch me. I'm invincible. In fact, let's party. Let's throw a big celebration. And he throws this lavish party, bigger than any other party of its time. Like, this was not just a few close friends over for dinner. This was a real celebration, and what it was his way of thumbing his nose really at God, because he's saying, I can do whatever I want and nothing can touch me. And I'll tell you, I got to thinking a little bit about that because, again, isn't that the way that, none of us are in an empire where the enemy's pounding down the walls, but you know what? Doesn't sin kind of operate like that? Like, I'll just give you an example. I know of someone back east, kind of a friend of a friend. It's no one that any of you would know, so I can tell you this without worrying it'll get back. But he's a guy that if you look through his Facebook feed, you'd see a pretty happy life. I mean, he's always out with friends and he's partying and life looks really good. But if you get to know him on a deeper level, you begin to see that there's a lot of pain and hurt and maybe anger, maybe loneliness. And so the life that you see on social media is really just kind of covering up what's really going on underneath. And I think we can all do that in different ways. Maybe you've known someone that pours himself into a career, and all they can think about is work and getting to the top. But really what they're trying to do is cover up for the sense that, who am I anyways? What's my purpose? Right? Or maybe you know people who they pour themselves into their kids or their family, and they pressure them to succeed at any cost. But what's really going on is this kind of, I need to prove my significance through my kids. And it sort of becomes a cover-up. It becomes a way of masking what's really going on underneath. Right? Sin is like that. Sin leads us to deny the realities of life. Sometimes the painful realities. It's a way we can cover up what's really going on underneath. Now there's more to the story. The king Belshazzar does something else. We read in verses 2 through 4 that he sends away for the gold and the silver articles that were from the temple of Jerusalem. Just remember, the people of Judah had been carried away into exile. It's been like 60 years. And so during that 60 years, these gold and silver and the articles of the temple had been kept somewhere. It's like Nebuchadnezzar the king who took all those things away from Jerusalem. It's like he knew that they were sacred. He knew enough not to, at least as far as we can tell, he knew enough not to throw big parties and use the articles from the temple. It's like he knew in his mind, okay, at least these are sacred and you respect that. But King Belshazzar is like, you know what? I can use those goblets. I can use that gold and that silver. Who's going to stop me? And so he sends away for them and he says, we're going to use these goblets and these things that were dedicated to God, and we're going to use them to serve idols. What we call it is profaning something. To profane something is to take something sacred and it's to use it for our own purposes. It's to take something that God intended to be used for Him and to use it for whatever we want to do with it. It's getting to decide for ourselves how something will be used. And it's taking something sacred and making it common. And when you look at it that way, that also tells you, that's a good definition of what sin is really all about. I think just about every kind of sin is taking something that God intended to be used one way and violating its purpose, using it in ways that we see fit. Just give you an example. Gossip. Probably all of us have struggled with that a time or two. Right? We all, from time to time, have maybe passed on that story about someone with no other reason than to maybe make ourselves feel good. But what is gossip really? You can't really understand why gossip is so destructive until you understand the purpose of language and of speech. Why does God give us the gift of speech? To encourage, to edify, to correct when necessary, to praise God, right? All those are the purpose of language. There's more too, but you get the sense. When we gossip, we're twisting around that purpose. We're distorting the purpose that God has behind speech. We're profaning speech. We're taking something meant for God's glory and twisting it around and using it for our own purposes. Someone once said, you can't understand sin until you understand purpose. That's what Belshazzar is doing. He's taking what God intended to be used for His service and for His glory, and he's using it for his own purposes. And what happens when he does that? Well, there's two things, at least two things, that happen immediately. Look with me at verses 5 and 6. Verses 5 and 6. The king is, it's like you get the sense that there's an immediate connection here. The moment the king starts using these sacred vessels for his own purposes, the hand begins to write on the wall. It's one of the only, maybe 2 or 3 times in the Old Testament where we read about the finger of God. That must have been something to see. Like you just look up and there's just a hand that's slowly writing down these letters. And it's something that's so terrifying that we read in verse 6, we read the king's reaction. His face turned pale. He was so frightened that his knees knocked together and his legs give way. you get the sense that this was a terrifying event. In fact, I'll tell you something. The Bible is using a euphemism here. You know what a euphemism is? It's a way of saying something a little more politely to sort of cover up some of the real meaning. In verse 6, where it says that his knees knocked together, the literal phrasing there is that his loins became unknotted. I'll let you use your imagination for what that actually meant. And here's why. Look, I'm not saying that to you just to get a reaction. I'm telling you the reason that's in there is to show you how far this king has fallen. The writer of Daniel wants us to see, here's this glitzy, glamorous king who's so full of himself. He wants to be the center of attention. He thinks he is so great that all these enemies pounding down the city walls, they can't touch me. And in an instant, he is publicly and utterly humiliated and disgraced. God is bringing this man low. He is humbling this man. Completely humiliating, completely embarrassing him. And then we're forced to ask the question, what's going to become of him? How will this king respond? Now, we should point out that this king had heard the stories of his great-great-grandfather Nebuchadnezzar, how God humbled him. And we're told a little later on in the text that King Belshazzar refused to learn the lessons of history. He wasn't going to humble himself before God. He wasn't going to have to listen to God. He was his own person. And now we're going to see the question. We're going to see what happens when you defy God. What happens when you refuse to humble yourself before God? What happens when you persist in your sinfulness, your rebellion, your defiance of God? And that's where we find out. That's where we see what is the message that God has for this king. Well, verses 26, we jump ahead a little bit. Verses 26 and 27 tell us what was written. 3 words, 4 words actually. The first word was repeated. Really it boils down to 2 messages, because the first word and the third word kind of tie together. The first word, mene, and the last word, parson, are really sort of 2 ways of saying the same thing, which is this. God is going to judge your rebellion as a king by putting an end to your kingdom and dividing it up and giving it on to the next king. So it was a message of judgment on the man's kingdom and on his authority. And then the word in the middle is related to that, but it's also a little different. It's really the message that you as a king, when you are weighed in the scales of God's justice, you're like dust in the scale. You don't even register. Your life has been meaningless and insignificant. Let's look at those both in turn. What's the message? And particularly, what does it say to us today? The first message is this. When you and I live as though sin is no big deal, it will destroy us. It will utterly destroy us. You and I live as though sin is harmless, and it will kill you. Or to put it a little differently, God doesn't look at sin lightly. But at the end of the day, he will judge it. Right? The king who was partying, fiddling while Rome burns, if you will, partying and celebrating while you have this army surrounding his city and threatening it, he says, you know what? I'm invincible. Nothing can touch me. I'm too powerful. He's met with death. He's destroyed. In fact, we read in verse 31, last chapter of the text, that the next king, verse 30 and 31, that very night, the Persians move in. He was a Mede, but the Medes and Persians were together. The Medes and Persians move in, and King Belshazzar is killed. He meets with this judgment. His kingdom is judged, and he personally is judged for his rebellion and his pride. We're told in that speech that Daniel gives, because you refuse to listen to the lessons of history, because you refuse to humble yourself before God, you and your pride and your arrogance and your defiance, you will meet judgment. Now listen, how does that speak to us today? What does that mean for us today? You know, so often we can convince ourselves that sin is not such a big deal. that God just kind of looks at it and says, well, nobody's perfect. Nobody starts out on a course of, say, an addiction, saying to themselves, you know what? This is going to destroy my life, my marriage, my family, but I'll do it anyways. How does it go instead? You start going down that road of an addiction, and you convince yourself, I can stop at any time. I'm not really hurting anybody. I'm in control of this. And little by little, you invite that destruction into your life. And before you know it, you can lose everything. You lose your job, you lose your family, you lose your marriage. Right? Sin brings destruction, but you know what? Ultimately, the even bigger picture warning is at the end of the day, we all have to stand in front of God and give an account, and God's going to look at sin, and He's going to judge it. And in our minds, we think that, how can that be? But listen, don't you realize that judgment is not just a temperamental God, zapping bad things. It's God's hatred for evil in this world and His commitment to dealing with it, to destroying it. And as much as we want to fool ourselves into thinking that we can get away with sin, that it's of no consequence, it's not that big of a deal, there's the warning for judgment. And the Bible says that ultimately the ultimate judgment on sin is death. That's the first thing. You live as though sin is harmless, and it will kill you. It will destroy you. Either or both in this world or ultimately in the final judgment. Now, what's the second message? If you live for the kingdoms of this world, ultimately they are dust in the scales. The kingdoms of this world, as glitzy and glamorous and as promising and as attractive as they might be, ultimately you stake your lives on those things, and it's dust in the scales. It all is meaningless at the end. The king who takes all these silver goblets and the gold and the silver, he says, I can use this however I want. He's told that he's going to be held in the scales of God's justice, and his life is going to be found wanting. It falls short of God's standards. Now, you and I, every day, we wake up and we're bombarded with messages and images and pictures and ideas of what the good life is all about. Some of you, maybe a lot of you, are going to watch the Super Bowl this afternoon. Nothing wrong with that. You're going to see a lot of commercials. Nothing wrong with that either. Some would say that's the better part of the game, right? Advertisers spend millions upon millions upon millions of dollars trying to convince us of what the good and happy and fulfilling life is all about. When you listen to music, you watch movies, TV shows, they paint a picture of what a good and fulfilling and happy life is all about. And it's easy to buy into that, and it's easy to live our whole lives for the things that this world treasures and values and esteems. The warning here is that if you live for the kingdoms of this world, ultimately it's dust in the scale. At the end of the day, if you set your life pursuing what this world holds near and dear, it's just dust in the scale. Now, the question that we have to ask and the question we have to really wrestle with is this. When you stand in front of God, what's He going to look at? What's He going to see? You know, you read the obituary section sometimes in the paper, and you just kind of go through and, sort of a summary. What mattered to a person? What was important to them? What did they live for? How would you answer that question? Because at the end of the day, here's the thing. God isn't going to look at your resume. He's not going to look at how many degrees did you earn, how many baskets did you make, what grades did you get. He's not going to ask you, how much money do you have in your bank account? How did your investment portfolio do? How big of a house do you? He's not going to ask you any of those things. What ultimately will matter is our relationship to Him. Are we serving Him? Now, what does that actually mean? I realize that when we talk about, God's judgment, there's something kind of like a red flag that goes up in our minds. We say, wait a minute. Isn't God, how can God be a God who judges? Right? That's such an Old Testament idea, right? God of the New Testament is mercy and forgiveness and compassion. All this talk about God punishing sin, that's so judgy. There's a lot we could say to that. I'm only going to focus on one thing to think about this morning, one answer to that objection, and that is this. If you look at judgment and you take that as a very, very negative idea, ask yourself if you have ever really been the victim of any kind of injustice. And what is that like? So in other words, picture yourself in court, and the perpetrator is standing in the box of the accused, and you're standing on the witness stand maybe, or you're in the viewing gallery of the courtroom. And just as the judge is about to pass down the sentence or the verdict, someone stands up and says, I get it. Yeah, what this person did wasn't good, but we really just need to be forgiving and merciful and kind, and that's really a nicer thing to do. Ask yourself how that sounds to you as the victim. See, the idea of judgment is God's commitment to dealing once and finally with the problem of evil in this world. The idea of judgment is God looking down at a world that He made that was perfect in every way and seeing the destruction that sin has brought about in this world and saying, I'm going to deal justly with that. Now, when you start, I bring that up because, of course, the message of Daniel was first written for the Israelites, for the Jewish people in captivity. They'd been oppressed by the Babylonians. They'd suffered under them. They'd watched their families carried off into captivity, some of them never to see them again. They'd lost everything at the hands of the Babylonians. And now the message is God saying to His people, one day God is going to deal with this evil. God isn't going to let this get away forever. God will deal with it. He'll punish the Babylonians. And God says the same thing about His whole creation. God's determined to deal with the problem of evil in this world and sin and destruction. Now the problem is we start talking about that, and of course evil is not just a problem out there in the world. You maybe know the story of G.K. Chesterton, the British journalist and Christian philosopher, and he was asked by the Times of London to write an editorial. And the topic of the editorial was, what is wrong with the world? And he wrote back his editorial. It was 2 words. Dear sirs, that doesn't count yet. Dear sirs, I am. What's wrong with the world? He says, me. Because if we start talking about God's commitment to dealing with sin, we have to ultimately look within ourselves and recognize that no one cannot be found wanting in the scales. All of us in the scales of God's justice, all of us ultimately amount to dust. Not one of us lives up, not one of us meets the standards of God's perfection and holiness and righteousness. So we can talk about judgment, but we can't be judgy about it. But here's the other thing. Not only does God commit to dealing with the problem of evil, but He also commits to showing mercy. And how does He do that? In the New Testament, in the Gospel of Luke, it's Luke 11, verse 20, Jesus is speaking to His disciples. He sent out 70 people into the world, and they've gone on this mission, and they've been casting out demons and healing the sick, and they see the power of God over the forces of evil in the world, and they come back to Jesus, and they report all this, and Jesus says, you know what? It's by the finger of God that I cast out evil. It's the only time in the New Testament we read about the finger of God. And it's almost certainly a reference back to Daniel chapter 5. It's really Jesus' way of saying, remember the way that the finger of God spoke judgment against that pagan king? I am now the finger of God coming to bring judgment on the forces and the powers of evil in this world. And that's exactly what Jesus came to do. He came to be the one to destroy the work of Satan and the devil and the power of sin in this world. And how does He do it? He lives the life that would measure up in the scales of God's justice. He lives the life of perfection. He lives the life of obedience. He is perfect in every way so that when his life is weighed in the scales of God's justice, him and him alone is found worthy. And yet Jesus, even though he was worthy, even though his life measured up, is lifted up on a cross. And he's punished, and he's condemned, and he's judged. And he experiences the anger of God and the wrath of God against sin. He's put to death. Why? So that when you and I look to Jesus and put our hope and our faith and our trust in him, then our sin is taken away from us. Our sin is removed and it's judged in another. See, the cross is God's determination to deal with sin, but also to show mercy to sinners. Don't you see? If you have this recognition in your own life that you don't measure up, you don't live a life that's worthy, you look and there's that emptiness inside. Here's the hope. The hope says, look to Jesus. And he is found worthy. And his perfection is credited to you. And not only that, but we're told later on by the Apostle Paul in the New Testament that Jesus comes to establish a greater kingdom. Jesus says that all through his ministry as well. The kingdom of God has come. He calls us not to live for the kingdoms of this world, not to pursue the empty pleasure and meaningless things of this world, but to live to serve him and to honor him as king. And when we do that, you know what? We receive the invitation to the greater party. You put your faith and your trust in Jesus, and one day he'll welcome us into the glory of heaven, where we'll sit down at the wedding feast of the Lamb, where we'll enjoy the party to end all parties. Not a party profaning the things that are sacred, not a party that's denying the ugly realities, but a party that's living as we were meant to live. Now, friends, we come to the Lord's table here in just a moment. And it's a hint of what's to come. It's a reminder that Jesus lived the life we could never live and died the death that we deserve, so that our lives are not found wanting. Our lives are not found empty. But it's also a pointer of what is to come. It's a pointer that says, one day the bread and the wine here will be fleshed out in its fullness. And we'll celebrate for all eternity with Jesus Christ, the King of Kings. Let's pray. Lord Jesus, we thank you and we rejoice that you and you alone have destroyed the power of sin and death in this world. You